This is Nature 5. If I hold up a hand like this, the anatomical shaping of this particular appendage is well known by now. The opposable thumb gives this architecture of the hand its whole prehensile quality. And if I use the thumb, the other four fingers coordinate so that the grasp itself is symbolic of a structure which has its purpose reflected in the unified distribution of its purpose. So that one of the most primordial symbols in human history is the hand. And the open hand like this is a universal sign of peace. In fact, almost in every culture. And so I use the human hand as the little emblem on all the books in the library. You find that hand, which I drew about 25 years ago. And this little hand is on all the books in the library here. That little hand, the origin of it was a brass door handle on a temple in Southeast Asia. And when the temple was bombed and burned in the Vietnam War, the handle was collected by a monk and made its way to Vancouver, and my students in Canada at the time made a contribution to the monk's vihara, and in turn they got that handle and presented it to me, and it's on the desk there with my daughter's photographs. It's the hand of teaching hand. When the middle finger is slightly bent forward, like the posture of straining, when the middle finger is slightly bent forward, that's the Buddhist mudra of teaching. And the tradition was that when the Buddha would begin to develop a sermon, a sutra, he would sit in a certain way and arrange the robes over one shoulder and settle himself squarely and begin to speak. But the first gesture was always the hand is a 5-phase energy cycle in miniature. And we've talked about how the Chinese worldview, the Taoist principle, integrates yin and yang along a 5-phase energy cycle. If you were to take a snapshot anywhere along that continuum of the 5-phase energy cycle, yin and yang would be a polarity. If you took an instantaneous snapshot, there would be a record of a calibration nick, a precise point, which would actually exist in time-space, and yin and yang at that point, at that calibration mark, would be a polarity. But the polarized nature of yin and yang in that point, at that calibration, in that photograph, is an artifact of the process of having taken a snapshot. In a way, matter, physical matter, in time-space, are all snapshots. And so the world of things is literally a collection of things by virtue of the fact that they all exist together in the same horizon of artifactness. It's artifactual, not because it's someone's fantasy. It's artifactual because of the process by which they actually are made. So that the world of things is artificial in terms of referring back to the process by which they are made. So that one can say, as James Joyce, at the end of the Portrait of Artist as a Young Man, he makes a prayer to God. He says, "O great artificer of the world, keep me in good stead in my life." And in that sense, God is the artificer of the world, who allows for the efficacy of the method by which the artifacts of all things are able to occur together and make a realm of what we call physical reality. Were the process that produces the artifacts not to happen, the question is, would there be a world of things? And the answer is yes, because the process that causes the artifacts is not a projection from human beings. Were there mountains before there were human beings? Most certainly. And so the old question at the beginning of the Enlightenment, posed so surprisingly mundanely by Immanuel Kant, who usually did not have mundane insights, is the kitchen chair in the kitchen when no one observes it? Is it still a kitchen chair and still there? The answer is yes. Unequivocally, yes. That nature occurs, that things are physically real, whether or not any human being is there, I guess we should expand it, whether or not any sentient being on any star system is participating in the artifactual process, it is still physically real. When you look in the night sky and you see the bright star Sirius up near the constellation Orion, you cannot see its white dwarf companion star, but it's still there, whether you can see it or not. Still, the gravitational effects in Sirius are quite serious, and one can compute this. We have a particular ignorance and hubris in our time, in the 20th century, by which we think that we are the first people to know this, the first people to struggle with this. And I think the genteel way in a good education is simply to assure you that this is not the case. One of the great classics of physics, 2,447 years ago, was Lucretius' De Rerum Natura. And the English translation here, which I like, Rolf Humphreys, the title is The Way Things Are. The Way Things Are. It's the physics classic of the late Roman Republic, the early Roman Empire. Lucretius, in De Rerum Natura, The Way Things Are, at the very beginning at Book 1. Like a good civilized gentleman in late Republican Rome, he invokes the blessings of Venus, not simply because he's superstitious and believes in mythologies, as you will see he does not, but because it is wise to know the inhabitants of the region where one lives and pay due homage. And so to Venus, creatress, mother of the Roman line, because all of the Romans were descended from the complement to Venus, Ares, the warrior. Mars and Venus, Ares and Aphrodite always go together. They're a pair, as it were. And we will see, if we can get there by today's lecture, that even black holes have atmospheres of pairs. In the case of black holes, pairs of electrons and positrons. in terms of Lucretius' time, Mars and Venus. He writes in translation, "All things conceived, all things that face the light in their bright visit." Notice the informed quality of Lucretius, that things are not just simply here, but they're visiting. They're coming in to being and they're passing out of being. And so the old Greek term for physics, physis, meant emerging, just as the Chinese sense for te, which is the operative wholeness quality of Tao, is that it brings into being. And we'll see that this became severely strained as an idea, as a conception, about 2 generations before Plato in Greek thought. And the issue became one of becoming versus being. And that this pair of becoming or being, do things have being, or are they just becoming? As a pair, are a mask in front of a much more primordial pair. And the much more primordial pair was not being and becoming, but being and nothingness. And in our time, one of the really great second-rate philosophers, Jean-Paul Sartre, wrote a wonderful, massive tome called Being and Nothingness. And his conclusion was that the human personality, at its most primordial focus, is a whole. And that the ego is a transcendental projection trying desperately to fill that whole with the images of things in order for us to feel that we are a part of something real and not to realize that we are a whole in reality. And this, of course, if one is simply French polemic in one's outlook, is a very depressing undercurrent to one's confidence that happiness can be something attained. Wonderful Simone de Beauvoir overlooked this particular thorn for many years and loved the man dearly. And so the French managed to live just the same. But what we're talking about here, all of these examples, all of this flow of language, starting with the hand and moving into the 5-phase energy cycle, and understanding that the pairedness in a frozen quality produced by the artifice of becoming produces the sense that positive and negative polarities characterize what is real. So that for someone like Lucretius, about 50 BC, he culminates the physics of about 500 years of development. And the physics that developed over those 500 years, by the time of Lucretius, had come to a certain understanding, very wise, which was completely forgotten and effaced by the later Christian fathers. So that this understanding was assumed never to have existed in medieval times and on up into really almost our own time. Lucretius writes in this way. He says, "So on you move. On you move." This is Venus. This is Aphrodite. This is Saraswati. This is the current of the feminine creative quality. We're not talking about sexuality particularly, though it manifests itself in a polarized thing as sexuality, but something deeper than that. After all, the charm of Aphrodite was not in her buttocks, but in her smile. So as to not be asinine about love, let's think about the charm of her smile. And so Lucretius, the physicist of his day, writing in a metaphorical way, which then was quite astounding and quite new, writes, "So on you move, goddess, over the seas and mountains, over streams, whose ways are fierce, over the greening leaves, the meadows, over the leafy tenements of birds, so moving that in all the ardor burns for generation and their kinds increase, since you alone control the way things are. Since without you no thing has ever come into the radiant boundaries of light, since without you nothing is ever glad and nothing ever lovable. I need you. I need you. With me, goddess, in this poem I try to write here on the way things are." Very, very excellent. And later on, he writes, "I shall begin with a discussion of the scheme of things as it regards the heavens and powers above. Then I shall state the origin of things, the seeds from which nature creates all things, bids them increase and multiply. In turn, how she resolves them, the seeds, to their elements after their course is run." In other words, seeds after their course is run resolve back to their basic elements. What elements would that be? It would be the elements that began when they came together and initiated the artificing process. So that the understanding of Roman physics, and I know it doesn't sound very chic to talk about Roman physics, but even Roman physics, I say, recognized that there is a substratum of mystery underneath the cycle of coming to be and flourishing and ending. So that this whole complication of physical reality, even in Roman physics, was recognized as what we would call, I think the English term is provisional. So here's a statement. Polarized materiality is a provisional condition of something else. And that something else is not a sum and it's not a thing. So our language, which has evolved in response to things, in its own limitations, obviates our expressive ability to speak deeper than the manifestation of the artificed objects. And we will see that the whole reason of developing a higher language, a different language, is to do an end run around, or to transcend above, or to eminently go below the limitations, the frame of reference limitations of a language which in its ordinariness refers to things. So a language which has things as a connotation is a limited set of expressions which cannot even talk about anything beyond the frame of reference. In a popular way, the mind of late 20th century man is completely stymied by black holes. And the popular mind thinks of black holes as some kind of metaphysical, phantom, nothingness beyond which must be only God or who knows what. Or perhaps some other universe, which in itself then would have black holes leading to, oh, well, you can see that infinite regression is still around. It's a characteristic of medieval limitations. Most of the people that one finds today are still medieval. In fact, actually Neolithic. Troglodytes. Means cave dwellers. My good friend Dr. Heller devised a clarification of human types, like sort of a Jungian human types, based on the troglodyte. And he came up with the beautiful thing that when they are young, they're called troglodytes. And after several glasses of brandy, decided that when they are conceived in the womb, they are troglodytes. One must have classification in terms of the polarized world. And in fact, classification in the Lamarckian version seems to be particularly fun when applied to a polarized world. What happens when one begins to talk about the real is that all the categories sort of go earthquakey. And their lines of demarcation of the Lamarckian, Demark, a little pun here, become the wavy lines of energy. And what one has then actually is a kind of a vibration matrix instead of the nice little post office box categorical structures. What we're trying to do in this education is to mature you away from the superstitious peasant mentality which has kept you in your cave-like existence since you were born, since your parents were born, since the whole tribal origin of your family lines were born, and it's time to come out and play. How do we begin? We have already begun. We're at the 5th lecture. We're at the movable thumb lecture of a 5-phase energy cycle. Nature's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 have this kind of a quality. They work together. It's the key, it's the prehensile key to the whole educational matrix that we have. Our pair of texts today changes from what it was. For the first 4, it was the I Ching and Thoreau, the portable Thoreau and the I Ching as a pair of texts. And we saw that with this pair of texts that we talked about nature as a matrix of change. That is to say, the yin and yang were not a polarized snapshot, a product of some artificing manifestation, but that they were constantly in a what we would call an oceanic process of interpenetration. So that the symbol for yin and yang was the Taoist symbol, the Tai Chi. And it's a symbol of interpenetration. In fact, it goes even deeper than interpenetration because you can have interpenetration in a mechanical distribution way. You could have the circle of light and dark and say make 3 circles, one within another. At the inner circle, you could have it split with a vertical line so that one half is dark and the other half is light. In the second circle, you could reverse it and have the arc of the second circle above the light have that dark. And above the dark half, you could have that arc light. And then in the third circle, you could have above the dark arc, above the light half, you could have that light. So you'd have light half, dark arc, light arc. And on the other side, the dark half, the light arc, and the dark. And so having this is also an interpenetration, but it's done by mechanical distribution rather than any kind of organic process. But in fact, an organic process is radically different from a mechanical process. A mechanical process registers like the snapshot and stays put. The stages of a mechanical distribution literally can be computed and will hold their frames of reference, while an organic process is always fluid, and its very fluidity produces a different kind of physics. In fact, a different kind of chemistry. Organic chemistry is radically different from inorganic chemistry. And the physics of dynamic processes is quite different from the physics of a mechanical situation. It's true that you can engineer with a mechanical engineering situation, but you cannot apply the mechanical engineer's limitations to the nuclear physicist, because the nuclear physicist works with a realm that has an organic quality, and thus one of our new texts is called the DAO of Physics. It has a flow capacity, and an organic distribution has a whole evolutionary career of its own, a whole flow cycle of its own. And interpenetration in an organic process has its ultimate purposing in not so much an interpenetration, but what is called a secret exchange of centers. So the Tai Chi symbol of Taoism not only is not a light and dark half, which would give you a mechanical distribution. The light and dark are separated by a kind of a wave, an S form. So there's a teardrop of dark and a teardrop of light together. That would be the interpenetration on an organic process scale. But Taoism is very sophisticated. As Lucretius says, occasionally men think things through. There's a dot of the light in the dark teardrop. There's a dot of the dark in the light teardrop, which shows that not only is there an organic exchange, but there is, to the nth degree, the secret exchange of centers. The great 8th century defender of the Mahayana, Shantideva, wrote once in his Bodhicharyavatara, Guarding the Mind of Enlightenment. Did you know that the mind of enlightenment needs to be guarded? He said, the most mysterious truth of this world is the actuality of the secret exchange of selves. It alone makes the transfer of enlightenment to limited, polarized creatures possible. And without it, it would not be able to happen. And so we will see that what characterizes an organic process is that the walls are not made of brick, but are made in the structure of membranes. And so when one is talking about the Tao of physics, one must talk about the occurrence of membrane surfaces in the universe, not just membranes in the cells of an organic occurrence like ourselves, but when one is talking about something like black holes, one has to talk about membranes. Kip Thorne's great volume, The Membrane Paradigm. If you get a chance, see that Kip actually signed this copy. And you'll notice his handwriting is perfectly scrabbled, which shows very organic mind. Did you know that black holes have membranes? Oh, yes. In fact, one can come to one of the standard books, Supermassive Black Holes, published by Cambridge University Press. And one of the chapters in here is Pair Atmospheres Around Massive Black Holes. The electron-positron pairs. The immediate environment of a massive black hole is a violent place. Enormous amounts of energy are liberated either by accretion or, if the hole is spinning, did you know they spin? Rotate. And it goes on. And you can, I've left these open with little marks here so that you can see some of the qualities. Here is the stretched horizon of a non-rotating or slowly rotating hole, page 27 of Kip's book. The frozen boundary layer. It used to be thought rather naively that black holes are like frozen stars, right? Just a frozen hole there. And of course that's the polarized, artifactual misrepresentation which the peasant troglodytic mind always transfers onto what it deals with, including teachers, including oneself, which is what is insidious. And the only thing a real education does is wake you up out of that fictiveness. It's not that the world is fictive, but that your whole process of chewing it up, mulching it, swallowing it, and digesting, that whole process of grasping distorts what is real and produces yet another cycle of fictive-making capacity. The insidious thing about making fictions is that if you continue to do it, you will continue to be able to do it. The whole process of an education is to wake you up from that. Because there is no possibility of your being yourself in that realm. No one ever became themselves in that realm. The only thing that happens there is the ongoing performance of the Wei Yang, the shadow puppet master. Let's have real values. Let's try to understand that we're not in a reductive mechanical process, but we're trying very gently with humanity to nourish and encourage in ourselves a series of transformations leading to the quality of a secret exchange of selves. I think the archetype in the West was always that if you give your life up in the right way, you will gain eternal life. Well, that was the old codification. Incidentally, it comes from Hellenistic Judaism and was accepted wholeheartedly by Jesus and thus by Christianity. Let's come to one of our texts. The DAO Physics, and its pair is galaxies, Timothy Ferris. Let's open this up so the camera can see something other than just the green. Galaxies. We're going to turn to the DAO Physics, but let's make the point that Galaxies and the DAO Physics, these two books, are a pair. Just like the Portable Thoreau and the I Ching are a pair. Why are we talking about pairs? Because even such a fundamental occurrence as a black hole has an atmosphere of pairedness which characterizes its stretched horizon reality, and that the pairedness has a universal process of formation and information, deformation, exfoliation, and that all of these are well known and can be applied. And so we can wake up out of the ignorance of peasant projection stupidity and begin to realize that there is a universe, including ourselves, which can be understood. In this pair of the I Ching and Thoreau, it's like Thoreau was the electron and the I Ching is the positron. In this pair, it's like the DAO Physics is the electron and galaxies is the positron. In other words, we're getting a whole series of paired texts that are going to arrange themselves. We're going to have 3 pairs in 8 sections. 3 times 8 is 24. We're going to have 24 pairs of texts. And we are also going to have 8 texts used by themselves that will pair themselves up in 4 other pairs. So there will be, in your education, 28 pairs. Yes, it corresponds with the lunar cycle. And so the architecture of this particular education has been thought through and worked out for quite a long time. And it will produce for you a working matrix by which you can literally compute your way to the real. But in order to let its quality not be snapshots of delusion leading polarities, try to follow through and allow for a transformation from each of the pairs in each of the quarters. And notice there are going to be transformation from the first pair to the second, from the second pair to the third, from the third pair to a 7th, a text whose pair will be deferred to later on. So that we will have 1, 2, 3 transformations in each of the quarters, making 12 transformations in a year, making a much stronger kind of computational basis than the zodiac. Frankly, astrology is a sandbox play compared to this. If you were on a star system around Aldebaran, the bright red star that is not all that far from us, this planet-based astrology is not going to do you very much good, because the stars are all different. Constellations are different. And if you were in another galaxy, there wouldn't be any of these stars at all. Don't wed yourself to drawings on the cave wall. Come out of the cave. It's time to stop being Neolithic. We have a different kind of universe to live in. The invitation is very clear. Live in the darkness or come out into the light. Come out. In this pair, we're going to talk about the DAO Physics, but notice that this book, Galaxies, is published by the Sierra Club in San Francisco. The Sierra Club, founded by John Muir, who is not to be written off at all. John Muir was not some kind of peasant bumpkin. He was an extraordinary mystic in his own right. And so the Sierra Club has matured to the point by 1975 where they included galaxies, the galactic level of the universe, as part of the extended wilderness in which man's spirit is preserved. And the quotation from the beginning is from Lao Tzu, the great Taoist master. Heaven's net casts wide. Though its meshes are coarse, nothing slips through. And so a book on nuclear physics talks about Tao, and a book on extragalactic astronomy quotes a Taoist. In fact, the origins of the DAO Physics, its first edition, in this volume, came out in 1975. They were published the same year, 1975. 1975 was a watershed year. Why is it a watershed year? Because it is a resonant membrane in the polarized conditions of time and space, and these two books together are a snapshot, a polarized snapshot of the world of the very small and the world of the very large, a la 1975. We can use this snapshot in our education to great advantage. Now, the production of DAO Physics actually began here in Los Angeles at the Zen Center, Maizumi Roshi's place. And the very first chapter of DAO Physics was in Zen Center Journal. I have a copy of it around here, the summer of 1974. And in a way, Kepra's outlook is more Los Angeles Zen quality with a lot of Castaneda mixed in. Sort of a early 70s mixture that appealed to a lot of people at the time. I rather liken it to a kind of a cough syrup that keeps your mind from really indicating its uncomfortability. And it has soothing qualities, but as you will see after the break, it's not quite accurate. So we will not only learn from, but we will learn in spite of some of the inconsistencies and some of the limitations of these things. We'll come to DAO Physics after the break, but on page 50 of Galaxies, the author Timothy Ferriss and his video of the creation of the universe from PBS Video we have available here, and it's a part of the nature section. And along with seeing the video Life on Earth with Richard Attenborough's brother David, you can see the creation of the universe, Timothy Ferriss, the author of Galaxies. And on page 50, he has this quotation. When a star explodes, it leaves behind two sorts of debris: that which has blown into space and that which stays behind. The material blasted into space expands until it has dissipated and mingled with the rest of the interstellar medium. They are called, in astrophysics, they would be called radicals, molecular radicals. And actually the list of molecular radicals has grown quite long. In the last 20 years, astronomers have detected in interstellar space, not on any planet, not in any star system, but in the vast gulfs in between the stars, almost all the radicals that constitute both the organic and the inorganic qualities of life. There are organic radicals of molecules in between the stars in the so-called, or used to be so-called, vacuousness of space. We'll come to see that the only thing vacuous was the kind of 1950s science fiction seeming mind that saw anything in behind of the Ford Fairlane as being alien. Our bodies, every atom in our bodies was once in interstellar space in between star systems, because that's the only way these elements are made. And so if you have anything above hydrogen in your body, it was all made in exploding stars long ago, and you, in your atomic reality, have drifted in between star systems almost without end. So don't feel that there are too many bad aliens out there. We're the worst aliens that we're going to find. He says the material blasted mingles with the rest of the interstellar medium, but the material left behind collapses to form a dwarf star, like the companion around Sirius, or a denser object known as a neutron star. That is to say, a dwarf star whose energy compacts until all of the electrons are stripped away and one has just pure matter of neutrons next to neutrons, no space in between. Somebody once said that a little tiny pepper pod seed of neutrons would fall straight through this planet. It would be so heavy it would just fall through the planet. So you can imagine a neutron star, even though it's only about 7 or 8 miles in diameter, is enormously heavy. But the career does not end with the process of dwarf star after a nova or neutron star, but ends with a black hole. A neutron star that becomes so dense eventually that it swallows its own light and becomes a black hole. And we'll see that black holes are not at all the hellish end. Our membrane paradigm, we'll do some quoting later on when we bring the DAO Physics forward. It's very easy to misread the DAO Physics, and so I'm going to just read along with you 2.5 pages. I won't read them out to you, but I'm going to present just the first 2.5 pages of the DAO Physics so that you can get an understanding of how much caution one needs to use in approaching some of these profound ideas. And I think that we should take a break at this particular point. Let's come to Capra. Let's come to the Tao of Physics. Let's come to page 19. That's as far as we're going to get today. I want to try in just a few minutes to let you see some of the fragile limitations so that you will not ooh and ah over Tao Physics, but take its good points in stride with the provisional qualities of context, which by 1975 seemed all right in a popular way. But it's an object lesson. The distortion that is required to make a popular appeal of wisdom is something to be attentive to. Generally, wisdom traditions have always hid their teachings. They were never given, except to those who, in a very serious way, qualified. One of the Chinese who wanted to study with Bodhidharma waited 12 years before Bodhidharma paid any attention to him at all. And finally, he cut off one of his hands and presented it to Bodhidharma. And Bodhidharma, accepting his hand, said, "You are ready to receive the teachings." In our time, there is so little wisdom and so little recognition of it that people X themselves out. You don't need to have any initiation other than just let people be themselves. That's a severe enough test. And so, as far as this particular venue is concerned, anyone who gets here, gets here. Capra, on page 19, says that there is a merging, a meeting, a synergy between Eastern mysticism and Western physics. Then he goes into a little excursus, that is a little explanation backing up what he has said, of a paragraph. He writes, "When I refer to Eastern mysticism, I mean the religious philosophies of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism. Although these comprise a vast number of subtly interwoven spiritual disciplines and philosophic systems, the basic features of their worldview are the same." You should know that there's as much difference between a Hindu and a Taoist as between a Jew and a Druid. Be circumspect about these things. He says this view, this subtly integrated mystic view, this view is not limited to the East, but can be found in some degree in all mystically oriented philosophies. And in fact, for Capra, for people of that generation, of that time, at this popular level, and this is popular. The encouragement of this perspective was due to, on the first level in a popular way, to Alan Watts, but underneath in a more deeper way by Aldous Huxley, whose book on the perennial philosophy made the case that all great religious insights, all great philosophic attainments were part of a perennial wisdom which reoccurred in various ways throughout human history, all societies. The Philosophia Perennalis. The argument of this book, writes Capra, could therefore be phrased more generally by saying that modern physics leads us to a view of the world which is very similar to the views held by mystics of all ages and traditions. And I think in a popular general way, this is a good beginning point. It's an observation that has an emotional appeal. It has somewhat of an indefiniteness intellectually, but that is consonant with, if you forgive me, with the author himself and the generation out of which this came. And being all of a piece can be taken just literally at face value. But for our education, we're coming along 20 years later in time, but on a much more profound level. In fact, this is written from a certain level, and all of this that is being spoken about here is from an organic, full phase of the entire realm of the real. He goes on to say that this spread of universal appeal, and he uses Aldous Huxley's general listing from the perennial philosophy, the Vedas, the I Ching, the Sutras, Heraclitus, the Sufis like Ibn Arabi, even the Yaqui Indian teachings of Don Juan. And Castaneda even has a quotation in here from the teachings of Don Juan, the quotation, "Any path is only a path, and there is no affront to oneself or to others in dropping it if that is what your heart tells you." And of course, that outlook and that particular attitude led to people shopping among spiritual traditions as if they were in a supermarket and pushing their little cart of their ego and saying, take a little of this, we need a quart of that, and you would end up with this bag of wonderful groceries which you would take home. And it was criticized at the time. In fact, it goes back to the 1960s. My friend Jacob Needleman wrote an article for a philosophic professional magazine, Mind, in 1967, I believe it was, criticizing that this whole methodology of grasping and clutching and taking parts here and bits and pieces there and stuffing them together to make some kind of a succotash for your own ego is a process which methodologically destroys the values, leeches away any kind of beneficent effect, and ends up by creating a boring gray where there should be a kaleidoscope of colors. Instead of the cauda pavonis of transformation, the peacock's tail of the spectrum of many colors, the whirling rainbow, one gets everything reduced down to a dull gray, sort of a gunmetal gray. And out of that boredom comes this insatiable need to go shopping again. And what looks good are these wonderful menus of weekend retreats here and days with here and there, and the whole entourage produces nothing but an ongoing accretion disk around a black hole. And there's nothing in it. It doesn't go anywhere at all. characterizes East and West then in this kind of bifurcation. He says that the West has a marginal mystic role, whereas the East had a mainstream mystic role. And a very nice kind of bifurcation, and like all bifurcations, a polarization, and like all polarizations, a snapshot which is misleading. In fact, if one takes a look at the Hindu pantheon and the politics of the Sangha and the Confucian state empire, these are all characteristics which make the East much more difficult to deal with wisdom mysticism than the West. The West has always been more perforated by its mystic tradition than the East. Case in point, if you talk to the 1,200,000,000 Chinese today, you will not find more than a handful of Taoists in all of that. That's a quarter of the Earth's population? You'll find more Taoists than that in Los Angeles. They don't understand their own mystical traditions. The same way in India. 40 years ago, when Vinoba Bhave was conducting his yajna across India, his sacred mission, using the age-old standard, almost middle-of-the-road yoga techniques that have been in India for thousands of years, he met with incomprehension everywhere in the subcontinent. So the myth that somehow Asia is spiritually alive and the West spiritually dead is one of the more misleading myths. Part of the difficulty comes from a preconception, which I think I need to bring out some kind of a correction here. And the misperception dates from the 1960s appropriation of a certain term, which was spun into a kind of a spreadable schlock in the 1970s and became the favorite dessert food of parties of cognoscenti would-bes in the 80s. And I think now is the time to wipe up the mess and throw the towels away. The word is shaman, and the idea was shamanism, and that somehow the real mystic guts of something was on the shamanic level. And so there are collections even of things called shamanic voices by people who have wonderful recognized name values and get all kinds of big name grants and invitations and so forth, and the literature on shamanism abounds. And before 1949, you would find it only in very rare anthropological reports. And generally, the person who brought that term as the foundation for the primitive or primordial mystical experience was Mircea Eliade. And his book on shamanism was translated into English to put into the Bollingen series, originally published in French, 1951, and published in English translation 1964. Shamanism, and its subtitle is Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy. The Greek term ecstasy, ekstasis, standing out from, ekstasis. One thinks of ecstasy as somehow connotated as a sexual ecstasy, that one is simply ravaged by emotion until one simply leaves oneself. And this kind of ecstasy, this kind of ekstasis, goes back to Aphrodite's smile, for that particular way of transcendence was one of three that were available in ancient times, or one should say in archaic times, for Eliade uses a more precise language. That is, before ancient times, there were archaic times. There are only three ways of leaving the body. One was through ecstasy, through a surfeit of physical experience, usually in a pleasure mode. Because the surfeit of emotional experience in a pain mode was something terrific, something that would terrorize you. And the mythological figures, since we're putting mythological figures on these, Greek mythological figures, for that was the place where the codification was clearest. Aphrodite as the goddess of ecstasy, and Ares, or Mars, as the god of terror. And so one could leave one's body through ecstasy or through terror. You could, through a terrific fright, be psychically exuded from your body, just as psychically one is exuded from their body in moments of high ecstasy. But there was a third way, the way of Athena. There is a way of the even-eyed, or as Homer would say, the gray-eyed equanimity of Athena's gaze. A third way of leaving, through transcendental wisdom. Through terror, through ecstasy, through wisdom. 3 ways. Shamanism is a version of the mulching together of terror and ecstasy. It's kind of a female version of terror, and it's a masculine version of ecstasy. So while there were female shaman, usually it was a masculine, a male shamanic figure. But what's interesting here, coming back to Eliade, I don't want to finish the thought about the male-female, just take it that there is a mixing of terror and ecstasy. Because of this, Eliade's shamanism was always paired with another book which he wrote. And this book came out just before Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy. And it was published in 1958 by the Bollingen Foundation. Original edition in Paris, 1954. It is called Yoga, Immortality, and Freedom. And so, shamanism and yoga form a pair. They form a pair. Shamanism being the ecstatic, terrific ways of leaving one's body, and yoga being the higher wisdom way. So that ecstasy and terror were braided together as one part of a pair, paired together with the transcendental way of leaving one's body. So that yoga and shamanism actually constitute together a pair transformed into one paired with a third. This particular structure, because of Eliade's excellence as an educator and as a thinker, Eliade is at least as accurate as Jung, and perhaps more so. That a third book was added to the Bollingen series in matching volumes, because that's the way things were done once upon a time, and because shamanism and yoga form a polarity pair, you need a resolving third, and the third volume is The Myth of the Eternal Return. And so these 3 books by Eliade actually go together. And when you put them together, what you get is a matrix of religious experience. And it culminates itself in many projects of Eliade. Here is a book published just a year or so ago, The Eliade Guide to World Religions. And of course the great 16-volume encyclopedia of religion and philosophy, the new updated version from the Hastings. All of this can be characterized in a very brief kind of mnemonic way. Shamanic experience is a kind of a nuclear fission. yoga experience is a kind of a nuclear fusion. And the two of them together, as a complementation, give us the cycle of the real. So that for someone like Eliade, the understanding, and I'm saying this in comparison with Capra, Eliade compared with Capra, Eliade is much more profound and understands that the East and the West have an interpenetrating quality all the way through their histories and at their bases in terms of India and Europe. So that the psyche of India is in the same pattern as the psyche of everything out into the Atlantic Ocean. From Ireland to India was a single psychic pattern. So that someone, for instance, in our own time, or just before our own time, like Evans Wentz, when he was in Ireland and he was doing, through encouragement of the work of Yeats and A.E., he was doing investigations into mystical Irish folklore. And in doing so, he wrote a book called The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries. And he recognized that at the deep basis of the Irish spiritual insight was something consonant with Tibet. And so he journeyed to Tibet to try and find out what this was. And of course, Evans Wentz is most remembered now, world famous for the 4 great books that he wrote and published in matching green volumes by Oxford University Press. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is the Buddhist shamanic experience, and the Book of the Great Liberation, the book on Milarepa, and the book on secret doctrines of the Vajrayana. Everything from Ireland to India is of a single kind of a pattern. It's a pattern which can be given in shamanism and yoga as a pair. But in the Western psyche, what is in the background is the resolving complementation of these two. So that it takes a real, let's use popular language, it takes a sharp cookie to be able to bring the background out and allow it to achieve a form. Why is it so difficult? Because as the background achieves a form, the formed foreground that one is familiar with goes into the background. And so you have to do a little bit of jujitsu. And in the process of doing this, you go through a process where there is no form, where the two are crisscrossing and exchanging. Because when the background becomes a form, the form becomes a background. And there is a moment. And because it is such a scary moment, even though it's just simply a moment, it's rather like the sound barrier. The more one approaches it slowly, the more you shake, psychically shake. It's a process that Jung gave the wonderful Latin term to, the mysterium tremendans. When you get into a negative neurotic feedback, you literally shake, not only your psyche, but your body. And if you try to stay there, it's a rather rough ride. It also has its blessing in a negative way because it scares hell out of you. If you let it go on long enough, one becomes very humble. You begin humming, "What can I say?" and taking long walks. The difference between the psyche from Ireland to India is that the shamanic yogic polarity are paramount, whereas in China, the background, because of the Tao, is what is paramount. Now this is an important distinction, one that Capra does not sufficiently make, but we have to make for ourselves. The Chinese understanding through Taoism. Or not even Taoism, because Taoism is a product, it's an artificial product of the 2nd century of the Common Era in China. There was no Taoism before then. In fact, it's due to several philosophers in the 400s who really codified and made a Taoism, a religious Taoism. Before then, there was no such thing as an ism. And what we're talking about here with the I Ching and with Lao Tzu is long before there was any kind of codification whatsoever. Because the codification of Tao into an ism is an importation of Western predilections into Chinese culture. They were never in Chinese culture before that time. The very foundations of religious Taoism in the 4th century of the Common Era are very much like the creation of Theosophy by Madame Blavatsky. There was a woman that had inspired writings, and the writings were then collected together, and then they were dispersed, and some of them were lost. And it took some kind of a psychic genius to bring them back together again and reconstitute them, and so these sacred writings became the beginnings of a mystical canon of ascended master lost writings that were brought back for the benefit of suffering mankind. It's a Western experience of this kind of polarity going through its process of vicissitudes and the limited conditions of time-space, and not at all characteristic of Chinese culture at all. Whereas the Tao that we're speaking of is peculiarly Chinese in that the Chinese had this as its form of civilization, and the polarity of yoga and shamanism was in the background. Whereas in the West, the yoga and the shamanism was in the foreground, and the eternal return was in the background. But the Western Hermetic tradition handled the eternal background with as much quality and tact and structural integrity as the Tao was handled classically by Lao Tzu in China. The Hermetic teachings of Pythagoras and Plotinus are as trustworthy as Chuang-Tzu and Lao Tzu. Absolutely. There's no preference whatsoever. And in a way, this is the object for us, is that the East-West is not a blending. It's not a mechanical redistribution. It's not some kind of making up for lost ground. It is not a first-time newness. It is none of those things. But something more significant, more profound, that has an applicability which can be expressed, as the Maharishi once wrote, the art of living and the science of being. One lives better, and the quality of one's there-ness, thusness, becomes more significant. And this includes a scientific, technological application. We're going to later on use Eliade's Myth and Reality, but I thought that you'd like to maybe see a contrast. Here's the first photograph of Eliade as a young student from Romania in India, and here is one of the last photographs of Eliade at the University of Chicago. And in between you can see the wonderful development of the man. But in between these two, rather close to this original, is an experience which changed Eliade, and you can see here. Now, the difference between the young man seated very calmly at his desk and the young man with the beard. This was his introduction to yoga and shamanism at the same time. And it's this man who grew into the wonderful, mellow, aged seer on the other page. This man would have grown into a much different person. This is the man that grew. For Eliade, it was rather a very difficult experience. He was invited to India by Surendranath Dasgupta, the greatest philosopher of the time in India, in Calcutta. And he was invited into his own home. And unfortunately, Eliade, being a very vibrant Romanian bohemian at the time, Eliade grew up living in the attic of his parents' house, and he had this huge collection of old used books, some 6,000 of them, that he would carry up and he would read by himself as a teenager up there. And he wrote a letter to one of the higher-ups in the government of Hungary saying that he deserved to have a scholarship to India to go study yoga, and he was surprised when they actually gave it to him. And Dasgupta himself thought of taking a European into his own home and teaching. This was how things were done in the around the First World War. But Eliade, unfortunately, was attracted to the man's daughter. And at that age, in Victorian India, in the upper classes, you didn't do that. And when they were discovered, caught, I think is the Hollywood word, Dasgupta sent him to the toughest ashram in the Himalayas. And the rishis there did what they always do. They take you apart very quickly. I think the Hollywood word is they shatter you. They start with your ego, they proceed to your mind, and then they finish you up your emotions until there's nothing left but a mess. And the only thing that gets up out of that mess is your transcendental self, because nothing else is going to work. And after a year of that experience, in which that photograph of the bearded young man, he was able to go back to Europe and carry with him a distinct impression that somehow yoga and shamanism go together in a very odd way, and hence the pair of the books. And it wasn't until much later in life that he was able to resolve this kind of conflict, and realize that that polarity was a snapshot of a living process that had to do with the energy flow of eternity. When you misconceive the energy flow of eternity as a circle, you get into a closed loop repetition called karma. When you open the circle so that it spirals, because of the nature of the real, it doesn't just continue spiraling out, but it spirals into a complex double involute, which becomes like the infinity sign, like a Mobius strip, and becomes eternity. When the circularity of time becomes a Mobius strip eternity, then one has wisdom rather than habit. That transformation is the responsibility of a good education, east or west, any time, and without which there is no maturation. The human person will never be real. There will be no souls to save. There will be no heaven to go to. There will be no God to resonate with whatsoever. And so the responsibility of a good education is a lot more than just teaching, reading, and writing, and getting you a job with the next law firm. It's a very serious matter. This quality of misunderstanding characterizes a whole generation out of which the DAO Physics comes. Literally, it's people who did a little of this and a little of that and put it together and said, we've got something going, instead of taking the decades and decades of work that it takes simply to go through it in the graduated way that alone leads to the quality of being able to teach it. And without that, there just simply is nothing to say. The exploration of physics, the atomic and subatomic world of the 20th century, writes Capra, revealed an unsuspected limitation of classical ideas. Now, I would like to amend what he says. Instead of it being an unsuspected limitation of classical ideas, that it was an unseen limitation in education. For indeed, the limitation that he alludes to being transcended by the atomic physics of the 20th century was understood as being a part of the major tradition, especially in the West, all the way from Pythagoras to Plotinus. There's no mistaking of this whatsoever. The limitation that he relates to of classical ideas in physics was not at all characteristic of the entire development from Pythagoras to Plotinus. In fact, perhaps all the way to the beginnings of the 5th century AD. The limitations that he alludes to are the limitations of what he calls a Cartesian worldview, the worldview based on a realm of ideation, called Cartesian because it refers to René Descartes, Cartesian, where the inner subjectivity is polarized and distinct from an outer objectivity, subject-object split, where we conceive ourselves egotistically to be a subject in a kind of objective physicality. And we need to struggle in the polarity of those two to maintain control. And so one is always fighting for control, to maintain the subjective over the objective. But lo and behold, when the subjective totally wins this struggle over the objective, not having the governor of objectivity anymore, the subjectivity tends to drift, and instead of creativity, one gets fantasy. So that one quickly tries to recoup this and go to the other end of the polarity and say, we need to be empirical about this. We need to be controlled by the objectivity, so that the subjectivity doesn't fantasize and get carried away. And so one becomes very rational about everything, basing oneself on objectivity. And lo and behold, that leads to a certain kind of fantasy too. There's as much objective fantasy as there is subjective fantasy. And it's rather like cat and mouse, because those two fantasies, being related together by a very common parentage, being resonances of a pair, they always find each other in order to have a good fight. And so you have the phantoms of the objectivity and the phantoms of the subjectivity constantly enjoying a good brawl. And the world that we live in is the nightmare remains of that brawl on a very wide scale. There's very little that's real. It's just makeshift defense or offense in this kind of a process. It's an unseen limitation in the educational tradition. This problem that was introduced by René Descartes is actually not introduced by him, but is characteristic of the whole history. In fact, history's East and West. The point that Capra makes is that somehow physics seems essential in viewing the nature of things. And that modern physics is said to have had a revolution in the way in which the nature of things is seen. And that the new paradigm in Western physics is very much like ancient Tao, Buddhist, Eastern metaphysics. What I would like to caution is that this is rather a simplistic overlay and should not be accepted as a working idea at all, but just as a provisional banner, as a kind of a motto, and that one can use it as a reference point, as a motto, but it's not at all a working idea from which one can base oneself in any real educational way. If you get interested, the Lucretius of 50 AD is the Roman codification of the great Stoic writer Epicurus. And Epicurus is the popularizer of the atomic theory of Democritus and Leucippus. But Democritus and Leucippus are in themselves commentators upon two very deep thinkers, Heraclitus and Parmenides. So that the whole basis of the classical physics of antiquity culminated by Lucretius, 50 AD, about the time of the murder of Julius Caesar. Lucretius physics is the physics that is passed on all the way until the time of the so-called Renaissance. It is Lucretius physics that is still operative. Now, it's modified from time to time by various independent thinkers, Roger Bacon, William of Ockham, and so forth, but it never went into general consideration until the time of the Renaissance. If one wishes to go to the very basis of the Western paired worldview, where one can see the polarity in its exactness, underneath all of the historical developments, one goes to Heraclitus and to Parmenides, who were contemporaries. Heraclitus is famous, especially for the saying, one cannot step into the same stream twice. And he used fire as a symbol of the constant flux of change. And when Sir Isaac Newton made his notation of the laws governing the universe, his mathematical term was fluxions, based on this flux, which comes from a Heraclitean understanding. And the genius of Newton was to take the flux of Heraclitus and factor it into a mechanical application, a mechanistic application of the distribution of energy. So that the Newtonian worldview that is revolutionized by 20th century physics, Einstein, Bohr, quantum, so forth, is a revolution of Newtonian physics, which is an ingenious refactoring of the Heraclitean flux with a mechanical distribution of a pair which were pointed out by Parmenides as being eternal. The pair is simply stated in this way. What is, what isn't, isn't. That being and nothingness are an eternal pairedness beyond which one cannot go. Upon the one, one can say only that it is one, and upon the nothing, one cannot even say that it is nothing. So that one would find a great difficulty in approaching Parmenides and trying to make anything work. And the person who tried most courageously was Plato. And so Plato and Sir Isaac Newton, separated as they are by about 2,156 years, one Platonic great year, the similarity between Plato and Newton is as if a whole cycle had come around and Plato and Newton are again struggling with the same issue. Plato with the raw Parmenides and the raw Heraclitus, Sir Isaac Newton, 2,156 years later, with the inherited resonances of Heraclitus and Parmenides, came to a very similar conclusion. And just as Newtonian physics was radically transformed by quantum physics some 200, almost 300 years later, I think we should say 250 years later, Plato also is revolutionized some 250 years later. But the quantum physics of that age, which revolutionized Plato's worldview, is the most unknown and most puzzling of all of the great syntheses of antiquity, Hellenistic Judaism. And it's an area that is almost completely unknown, almost completely unstudied. If one went to Plato, he takes Parmenides, he takes the what is and the isn't, that fundamental polarity, and one would call it, I think in philosophic language, a disjunctive polarity. They do not meet. There's no way to put in the same phrase, in the same expression, is and is not, and still have it coherent. And of course we do, in a logical way, include yes and no in the same expression, but one should, in a technical way, recognize that this is a snapshot. The yes and no together is a snapshot, a polarization of the true disjunctive flow that is and is not never occur together, ever. That the one is the background to the other, and as the other comes into a form which one could talk about, the other exchanges with it and becomes a non-form that cannot be talked about. That the only way someone could talk about this would be from the dialogue position of a third man. Of a third person, of a resolving third. And so most of the great esoteric essays in Plato in the 20th century are all about the third man theme in the Parmenides of Plato. And one would come to an excellent commentary on Plato's Parmenides, like this one by Robert Brumbaugh, Yale University Press. Plato on the one, the hypotheses in the Parmenides. That somehow oneness is very mysterious. Because the only background that can sufficiently and necessarily support oneness is nothingness. And so the very precise vacuousness of nothingness contributes to the very precise thusness of oneness. Which is why the two together constitute a complementation of the real, which is always a mystery. Not a mystery because one doesn't understand it, but a mystery because one does understand it. One knows exactly that it is a mystery. Now this is the basic, quote, philosophy of nature, East and West. Except that in the East, the nothing, the Tao, nothing is the form. And in the West, the polarized occurrences, the atoms, the forms, are what is taken as the focus of attention. So in a way, one would like to see a pair. One would like to see a Greek philosopher and a Chinese Taoist of, say, the 3rd century BC, what they would say to each other. if one were a kind of a Harold Pinter writing this kind of one-act drama, they would meet each other on the stage in such a way that they would pass by each other without saying a word, because they would not see each other as worth talking to. That would be the most excellent way of presenting this. A one-act play in which there are no words spoken, and there's only one grand processional of the two crisscrossing the stage. Well, I think John Cage could have done the music for it. More next week.